Excuse me, are the media all here? Are they? Hallelujah. Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon we have a very special guest. Her name is Jacinta Price. If you've been following Australian politics, this has been a standout personality, not just because of her long record, which is highly credible, but because her message has been truly about equality. That if people are given the tools, then they will achieve to the maximum themselves. And that they do not need a paternalistic hand up. They just need the tools to take them as far as they can possibly go, and qualified only by their effort and their drive. Her name is Senator Jacinta Price, and we are enormously privileged to have her here in our country and here in the Waikato and at the New Zealand First Conference and Convention for 2024. Senator Price.
Well, g'day everyone. I firstly really want to thank Right Honourable Winston Peters for firstly inviting me here to this beautiful country this is the first time I've had the privilege of being in New Zealand. My husband and I, actually, our own son came and holidayed in Hamilton a couple of years ago with his best friend, whose grandmother originates from here. So there you go. He made it before we did. So it is an absolute privilege to finally get across the ditch and spend some time with our cousins. So first of all, thank you all very much for having myself and my husband Colin here. Thank you. So it is an honour to be able to share with you all here, especially given recent circumstances politically for us in Australia. So while Australia, of course, is different from your wonderful country, there are many things that we share. Your Kiwis, of course, have the Māori, and we have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and culture. Both beautiful, both rich in culture and in history. But if you ever mix up a haka with an Aussie footy chant, mate, you're in for a rude shock. One's sacred and the other involves a bloke in a mullet with a stubby of VB. Rugby, sure. The Kiwis have the All Blacks and they're good, we'll admit that, you know, even if we let you win most of the time. But cricket, that's our territory. At the end of the day, the similarities come down to the fact that we both believe in a fair go. Equality and time off for the weekend, right? We love our weekends. Not so much us politicians, but for the rest of you. In those respects, we're really two sides of the same coin, or should I say, the same $5 note, since we've both got King Charles now. So with our commonalities in mind, I'm really grateful for the chance to be here with New Zealand First to share with you this afternoon. By way of background, I sit in the Australian Senate as part of the Country Liberal Party and Senator for the Northern Territory. When it comes to federal parliament, I sit in the Nationals Party room as part of the coalition. I was also appointed Shadow Minister, that's probably me looking too far into the future, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians in 2023. And for the majority of my time in Parliament, my shadow portfolio of Indigenous affairs has been central to our national conversation. Last year, of course, we had a referendum on whether to change the Constitution by establishing a body known as The Voice. It was sold as a way of Indigenous Australians being given a voice as the body could make representations to government about Indigenous matters. But what I knew from the start was that if it was successful, this body would permanently divide our nation on the basis of race. There were some pretty dangerous ideas underpinning the referendum, and I want to look at a couple of those as a way of identifying the better ideas that I believe that will not only benefit Australia and New Zealand, but our Western world, of course, more broadly. But before I get there, I know that much of my conviction about these issues comes from my upbringing. As someone of mixed heritage, Warlpiri on my mother's side and Celtic on my father's side, I was always taught the value of both cultures. I was immersed in traditional Aboriginal culture, having a deep understanding of my jukurba, or what we call dreaming, that connected me and my story to those that came before. See, I have my personal totem is Yirrkapa, or crocodile, from where my baby spirit comes from in the north of Australia, on the Tiwi Islands. Now, you don't often like to think of this, but for us Warlpiri people, for Aboriginal people, our conception site is where we believe our baby spirit has leapt from the ground into our mother's belly, giving us our personal dreaming. So that is crocodile for me. But I also have my inherited dreamings because my mother is a desert woman from the desert, and they are ngapa, which is rain, and warlu, fire. So I think that makes up for a pretty, I often said, I don't know if it's the Warlpiri or the Irish in me, but it could also be a combination of my dreamings that gives me the feistiness that I require for political debate. But on the other hand, I also visited places with significance to my Celtic roots. So I had the wonderful opportunity, because my parents loved human beings and decided we'd go on a 3-month journey around the world as a 12-year-old. And part of that journey was visiting every single standing stone in Ireland, what I felt was probably every single cathedral in Europe. But looking at places like the Giant's Causeway, and realising these are the jukurba stories for the Celts. And there are many of these jukurba stories around the world, and events that I heard of and learnt of that made me realise, while we have differences between us as human beings, we also have many similarities. And I didn't view my life through the lens of race or by the narrative that I was an oppressed victim of colonisation. Rather, I grew up knowing that I was Australian, proud of it, and had no trouble reconciling both my Celtic and Aboriginal heritage. I mean, you can't get more reconciled, right, when you have those parents. I'm grateful for that grounding, because I've seen the devastating world that has emerged as a result of believing that those issues can be true. In Australia and in New Zealand, that world looks like one where Indigenous people are somehow treated differently and are often encouraged to depend on welfare, rather than to become economically independent and stand on their own 2 feet. That is something I've become firmly convinced of, that the best way forward is through economic empowerment. But for economic empowerment to flourish, of course, there needs to be a reduction in bureaucracy and what I would call black tape. In Australia, I've been fighting against the black tape, which causes traditional Aboriginal owners to be land rich but dirt poor. We have a multitude of organisations and bureaucracies which often stand in the way of meaningful economic development for Indigenous Australians. We're also dealing with a rise in activism, often by people who are somewhat removed from the actual project, but who seek to use Indigenous issues as a way of achieving their anti-development agendas. I know the same is true for here in New Zealand, and is why New Zealand First here and I in Australia are both on a mission to reform our legislative frameworks. Just as New Zealand First is looking at ways to review and reform legislation that refers to treaty principles and Māori affairs, I have been advocating for reform of the laws that govern Aboriginal land title and rights. Growing bureaucracy and centralised control are doing nothing to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians or Māori in New Zealand. I know that our respective fights for reform are both driven by a desire not to become the lands of missed opportunity. We know what our countries have to offer our people, but we have to make sure our laws allow for that to be a reality. Thankfully, one thing that doesn't need reforming in Australia is the voice. Because I'm sure, as you're all aware, it wasn't ultimately successful. It was rejected by Australians at an average rate of 60%. And I was privileged to be be at the forefront of the No campaign, leading a grassroots movement of Aussies who didn't want to see Australia divided by race. While I was at the forefront, my family was right there with me. Family, I know, is a value we Conservatives hold dear to our hearts. My husband, Colin, in particular, he's here with me today, rode those waves, or perhaps tsunamis, that came with the journey of the referendum. My family not only shared the success of the referendum night, but they also experienced the demands of a relentless campaign, the threats, risks, and the toll it took, both emotionally and physically. I'm also especially grateful for the support of the Honourable Casey Costello, one of your own, who travelled all the way to Canberra to warn Australians, do not go down the road of division. So this coming Monday, the 14th of October, will be 12 months since the referendum. And this date, of course, is a significant day for both our countries. New Zealanders voted for a coalition government that would take them on a road toward unity, and Australians voted against an entrenched voice and attitude of separatism. In the Anzac Spirit, our two nations led the way for the Conservative cause. I think that deserves a round of applause. One of the biggest problems I had with the voice was that it was race-based, of course. It assumed that all Indigenous people were disadvantaged purely because of their heritage. How racist can you get? And from conversations I've had with Kiwis, this is an idea that's gaining momentum right here in New Zealand as well. Aside from being incorrect, it often means that people of a certain race receive benefits that they don't need at the expense of those who are in genuine need, those who are disadvantaged, but of course have the wrong racial heritage to be helped. The truth is, you are not disadvantaged because of your race. And if we actually want to tackle disadvantage, we have to look beyond race. We have to find where the need actually exists. I know I'm preaching to the choir when I say these things, but New Zealand First supported the de-establishment of the Māori Health Authority. That is a testament to your belief in the need to treat all New Zealanders on the basis of need rather than race. Additionally, New Zealand First has shown support for changes to child protection laws to stop children being left in dysfunctional circumstances in the name of connection to their culture. This too is an important stand you've taken against separatist ideology in your country, and one that is desperately needed within our child protection system in Australia as well. As far as I'm concerned, it is racist to leave a child in dysfunctional circumstances because of their race, because of supposed connection to country and culture, as it is suggested in Australia. That is the true racism. For our children in Australia, Indigenous children are also Australian citizens and should be afforded the same rights as any other child in our country. Back to the voice. I can keep pointing out the problems with the voice. But another problem with the voice was the idea of truth-telling. Now, I have no problem with telling the truth. In fact, I expect that's why this kind of language was used to begin with, of course, because who wants to go on the record as objecting to the truth? But truth-telling these days is often just a cover for a one-sided version of history. The truth is, both New Zealand and Australia have a complex and nuanced history. And we need to be able to have mature conversations about those histories, instead of using them to keep non-Indigenous people eternally guilty and Indigenous people bitter and unable to forgive. Many people have a romanticised picture about life before British settlement in both New Zealand and Australia. But if we're truly honest, we would agree that a society ruled by traditional cultural laws is probably not a world in which any of us would like to live today. I know that I don't want to be married off in an arranged marriage to be the third wife to somebody who's probably 50 years my senior. I get that there's many lovely gentlemen out there, probably 50 years my senior, but it's certainly not what I'd like to be subjected to in terms of my traditional culture. So while wrongs were committed at settlement, for sure, on balance, the Judeo-Christian foundations are largely what enabled our and other Western countries to lead the world as democratic, free and prosperous nations. They are the foundations that gave inherent dignity and worth to all people, that gave principles like the rule of law, where all stand equally before the law and none above it. We have to educate our children about our history accurately so that our future generations are proud of who they are and where they came from. For New Zealand, your history includes the Treaty of Waitangi. Australia, on the other hand, was settled without a treaty. While I won't labour the reasons why today, I believe the course of Australia's history since settlement has brought us to a place where it simply wouldn't make sense to introduce a treaty today. Many advocates of treaty in Australia appeal to symbolism. And in fact, during the referendum, I was often asked, why is it such a big deal to you? If nothing else, the voice would provide symbolic recognition for Indigenous people in our Constitution. Why do you want to stand in the way of that? But see, to be really honest, I'm not interested in symbolic recognition for Indigenous Australians. I'd rather use my time and energy to make a practical difference in the lives of our most marginalised Indigenous people. That is, after all, what I am responsible to do. And in fact, it's the increase in symbolism that drains many cultural practices from their original meaning and significance. As an Indigenous Australian myself, there are elements of my own culture that I don't want to engage with sometimes. They have been diluted, hijacked by virtue signallers, even reinvented, and I generally have no interest in participating in them. I don't know if you've flown around Australia, but every single time you land in a Qantas airplane, there is an acknowledgement of the country you've just landed in. I thought we were all one country. What am I missing here? We all belong to it. Anyway, it's been said that a city divided against itself cannot stand, and the same can be said about our countries. That's why these race-based policies and agenda-driven versions of history are so pernicious, because they divide us and erode the values that have made us so great. So when I fight back against the false narratives and political attempts to sow division and separatism, I do it with a larger vision in mind. I do it because I see the threats that are lurking on the horizon of the West. Hamas, Hezbollah, powers like China, Russia and Iran are becoming bolder and more audacious in their attacks on the Western world, both physically and, of course, most certainly ideologically. And we can't hope to win any ideological or physical war in the West when we are teaching our kids, our future defence personnel, to be ashamed of their country, its history and, of course, its values. Defence recruitment is down in both Australia and New Zealand. And I think we underestimate the influence of our children simply not believing in their country enough to want to defend it. Well, I've spent a lot of time talking about the problems I see with separatism and division. I'm also filled with hope and optimism about the future. There is a federal election on the horizon for us folks. Sometimes progress toward a better future feels like turning a ship around, incredibly big and incredibly slow. But when I see and hear people like yourselves, New Zealand First, who are standing up for common sense, fighting against separatism and division, I truly am so encouraged. Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause, please. And you know, maybe, just maybe, from our corner of the world in the Pacific, bonded by the Anzac Spirit, Australia and New Zealand could be examples to the rest of the Western world. Where all people, whatever their heritage, are identified first and foremost as citizens of their shared homeland, united under one flag. Where we are honest about our history, engaged in its nuance, and practicing forgiveness and a willingness to move forward. Where our children are proud of who they are and their belonging to a free, democratic country that values humanity. So thank you to each and every one of you today for your part, playing your part in the making of that reality in New Zealand. My hope is that this weekend, iron can sharpen iron, that we might encourage each other in our shared goals of turning back the ideological tides that are buffeting our shores and uniting our people to move forward together. Thank you.
What a speech. Another round of applause to Senator Price. So I understand, media, that we're going to do a stand-up just out in the foyer. So if you'd like to make your way over there, Mr. Peters and Senator Price will join you soon. Right, we are moving on to the remit session. So does everyone have their remit tracker? Pull those out, please, and your notes.